He said, this is the only thing that's ever worked. Couldn't write it down. It's a good diet. Stop your eating. If you see it and it looks all sweet and tasty, well then keep walking. Because you're a fat little boy. That would make a good Nutrisystem commercial. I'm Tommy Sullivan for Nutrisystem. Send in $49.95. We'll send you a big box of nothing. Now go on.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, October the 5th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Squawk Box, Stuart Varney, My Take, Disbarred, Recent History, The Rape of the Mind, No Free Lunch, Rules for Retrogrades, Rules for Patriots, Bishop-barron, and Inside Delta Force. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
Yet each favor and handout and protection of vested interests shifts the direction of capital and labor artificially, resulting in overinvestment in, say, mortgaged houses or an overinvestment in corruption. Deirdre N. McCloskey. Cronyism is not patently unfair, but it is highly distortive to markets and ultimately leads to malinvestment. We have seen this in unspeakable application with the housing crisis, and yet those who would have the government put their thumbs on the scale of a given sector or industry have in no way been muted.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
Chapter 13. Intrusion by the administrative mind. Since social life has become more and more complicated, a new group of mediators between man and his goals has developed. It is no longer the ancient priest who mediates between man and his gods, between man and the powers beyond him, but a group of administrators have, in part, taken over the job of intervening between man and his government. There are today mediators between man and his bosses, between artist and public, between farmer and market, mediators between everything. The administrative mind is born, often dominating man's social behavior and man's manifold contacts, leading him into complicated actions and compulsions far beyond spontaneous behavior. All these ties, the rigid bureaucratic ones and the useful administrative ones, have their influence on human behavior and often may befog man's free thinking. I have a special reason for developing this theme in a book on the rape of the mind because this problem of mediation between man and his actions and thoughts exists in our form of democracy, as well as in the totalitarian countries. Both halves of the world are grappling with the involved problem of how to administer themselves. The mere technique of governing ourselves and our world can become a threat to free human development, and this may be independent of the ideology the administration adheres to. We have not the same freedom to choose the official men who govern us that we have to select our favorite shop or our doctor. As long as the official man is in charge, we are in his bureaucratic power.
And that was The Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades, 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
Rule 29. Never let your judgment be rushed or altered because of an alleged emergency. All serious policy initiatives deserve thorough vetting. Radicals love crises because every crisis provides them with leverage to fast-track their agenda under the cover of an exigency and its corollary hubbub. As we've already alluded to, since truth and reason are on the side of the retrograde and not the radical, where there is robust and fair public discourse on a given subject, the soundness of the retrograde's position and the unsoundness of the radicals will be made manifest. A prime example of this is the national debate over the permissibility of abortion. In the decades since the Supreme Court handed down its foul decision in Roe v. Wade, public opinion on abortion has flipped, and America has transitioned from a predominantly pro-choice nation to a predominantly pro-life one. The ambitious radical, therefore, must advance his agenda through sleight of hand and gimmicks, seeing as how when he fights toe-to-toe with the retrograde, he is destined to lose. Guerrilla warfare is the radicals' wheelhouse by necessity. Since a thorough discourse on a policy matter undermines the position of the radical, then it is intuitive that he should seek to expedite such discourse or circumvent it altogether. However, this poses a significant problem. Even the more jejune political muggle is well aware that weighty policy decisions should not be made in a hurry, as haste in important matters lends itself to cataclysmic mistakes. The radical must therefore proffer a reason sufficient to justify shortening the standard public vetting period. Yet, a sufficient reason is difficult to manufacture, even for seasoned manipulators. The radical is clever, though. He bides his time and waits, and the 24-hour news cycle eventually bails him out, providing him with a much-needed catalyst, a headline sure to touch a raw emotional nerve with an overwrought public. Any story with a plausible nexus to a policy initiative that the radical wants to advance will do. Needing no more prompting, the radical and his media spin machine go to work, agitating for immediate action in the form of the adoption of the radicals' policy initiative, of course, to be taken to remedy the problem at the heart of the news story before any more lives are lost or damage is done, etc. Recent times are dogged by examples of the foregoing modus operandi. Each time a mass shooting occurs, we are barraged by the same nauseatingly stale calls for common-sense gun legislation. Anytime a tragedy befalls a group of immigrants crossing the southern border illegally, we can count on having to abide a torrent of lobbying for comprehensive immigration reform, i.e. amnesty. Every time there is particularly inclement weather, perhaps a spate of hurricanes, we know that calls for anti-climate change legislation will climb to fever pitch, because hurricanes didn't take place before the Industrial Revolution. Every time that, due to a glitch in someone's insurance, they are denied funding for a serious operation, we know that calls for universal government health care are right around the corner. Even though these types of stories make the headlines for the very reason that the events they describe are particularly severe and relatively uncommon, radicals play act that the reported goings-on are a daily bane for society, and that if decisive action isn't taken quickly, the results will be catastrophic and irreversible. For whatever reason, perhaps because of their insatiable thirst for popular adulation, mod cons find this sort of feigned urgency difficult to ignore, especially when they feel the weight of their ill-informed but boisterous constituents' gazes. Channeling Chicken Little, running around aimlessly, squawking about how the sky is falling, panicking mod cons rush to cooperate with radicals on new policy initiatives, even before the sociology or science tasked with exploring the cause of the tragedy has been settled. But this self-defeating impulse must be avoided. The principled man cannot allow himself to be held captive by his swirling mercurial passions. While the dictates of the virtuous man's emotions will often overlap with the dictates of his reason, since Providence saw fit to gift the passions to man to move his will in harmony with the movement of his intellect, there is no guarantee of emotive infallibility east of Eden, even in those of most august and noble character. It's the intellect's purview to discover the truth with certainty. The passions, raison d'être, is to inflame man to love truth. And while the passions often light up in recognition of that which is right and bristle at that which is wrong, they remain a very fallible epistemological tool. It is evident, then, that correct policy decisions are the offspring of reason, not emotion. Owing to this, it is a trap to be avoided to rush to make policy decisions, bypassing thorough debate in the weeks after a tragic event. Retrogrades must never act on passion to the neglect of reason. Yet, when radicals piggyback advocacy for their policy initiatives on the heels of a recent tragedy, this is precisely what they're goading us to do. To be sure, national tragedies like Sandy Hook and the 2017 Las Vegas shooting shocked and made heartsick every retrograde in America. Nevertheless, the retrograde knows that inaccurate policy solutions are two-headed serpents. They're dangerous affronts to liberty and simultaneously impotent for preventing recurrence of further tragedies of the same kind. The risk of inflicting mortal wounds with ill-considered policy decisions will always be nearly infinitely greater than the risk posed by a reluctant, procedure-bound legislature. One need look no further than to the grand failed political experiments of the collectivist governments of the 20th century for proof of this. The retrograde must be prepared to suffer slings and arrows for being so-called heartless when, in his methodical deliberation, he refuses to run blindly over a legislative cliff. Truly stoic leaders will always have to carry the cross, that is, to suffer the myopic belly aching of their short-sighted flocks. It is far better to suffer such mortification than to act rashly, either in a fit of rudderless emotion or in an effort to showcase one's wealth of compassion. When we take action too hastily, abridging the salutary deliberative process so crucial to healthy self-governance, we are almost assured to err in our judgments, swallowing the poison pill of radical policy initiatives. Resist this at all costs.
And that was Rule 29 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots.
Justice, law, education, validation, charity, etc. in the society. And that something usually ends up being the state. As G.K. Chesterton once observed, when government removes God, government then becomes the God. Next question. What kind of tax system is most effective? Answer. The tax and monetary system that was in place in this country prior to 1913, which was prior to the confiscatory federal income tax and the printing of a fiat currency, that helped encourage the greatest growth of human freedom and prosperity the world has ever known. Since abandoning that foundation, we have increasingly become a debtor nation/people. I may have gone to public school and not the Ludwig von Mises Institute for Advanced Austrian Libertarian Economics, but even I'm smart enough to know to go back to what worked before. Question. How do high taxes on the wealthy impact an economy? Answer. Every job I've ever had came from a rich person, so I'm not sure how punitively punishing the very people who provide jobs will create more of them. Question. What is the cause and solution to poverty? Answer. The greatest way to combat poverty is to first recognize what causes it in the first place. Sinful human nature. Sometimes that sinful human nature manifests itself as a robber baron who exploits the community's natural and human resources, thus making it harder, if not impossible, for his fellow man to maximize his God-given talent so he can provide for himself and his family. Sometimes that sinful human nature manifests itself in the wrongful choices individuals make that put their livelihood and prosperity at risk. Either way, this is the reason why God gave the church the primary role of distributing charity in human society, because ultimately the church has the moral message to confront the evils that cause poverty in the first place. When an amoral agent like the state intervenes instead, the best it can do is apply a band-aid to a flesh wound. It can treat the symptom, but it lacks the prescription to become the cure. Then, after a while, it becomes an enabler of the very thing it's trying to fix, just like it is today. Question. What role do workers' unions play in an economy? Answer. Human history has shown that whenever power is concentrated in the hand of a few, or just one, corruption is bound to take place regardless of the belief system of those or the one in whose hands the power lies. That's why historically unions played a vital role as a check and balance on unfettered corporate power. Obviously, unions have also struggled with the same fallen nature manifested as corruption that corporatists have. Nowadays, unfortunately, unions, particularly government sector unions, do not primarily serve the needs of their workers, but are more or less a funding stream and campaign platform for the Democrat Party. So while the union bosses have a seat at the table, the workers are worse off. Question. How does a minimum wage requirement impact an economy? Answer. How can a government know what the minimum wage should be? Can anyone even support a family on the minimum wage? Here is the reality. Real wages in this country have declined in relation to the rate of inflation/debt since these sorts of government schemes to contrive equality began. Our wages nowadays do not have the buying power in a consumer-driven economy they once had, which is one of the reasons we carry so much debt. Just about every major purchase a family makes these days is made on credit. These schemes are actually harming the very people they purport to help because they're operating outside the natural laws of economics. Let me give an example. Suppose a movie theater owner has calculated the job of popcorn attendant is worth $5 an hour based on his business model and the current job market. In other words, based on finite objective standards. However, the government comes in and mandates he pay a minimum of $10 an hour for that job instead, under the subjective guise of fairness. The movie theater owner doesn't just cut into his own profit margin to cover the increased cost out of the kindness of his own heart, but rather jacks up the price of popcorn to pass along his cost to the consumer. Now the market, tethered by competition, is no longer setting the price, but government artificially is. That sounds well and good until you and I go buy a popcorn the next time we're at the theater, and we're still making the same amount of money we were making before the price got jacked up. Since we can't go back to our bosses and demand a raise to cover our popcorn habit, right away our buying power is diminished by this government intrusion into a consumer-driven economy. Not to mention, so is the popcorn attendants. Because on his night off, when he takes his date to the movies, he'll notice he's making more money, but now this date is costing him more money too. He's essentially being given the bill for his own minimum wage increase. And he'll notice the same thing at the restaurant he takes her to, and everywhere else where entry-level workers were given a completely contrived minimum wage increase. In other words, his minimum wage increase is at best a revenue-neutral transaction once the arbitrary consumer price increase offsets the arbitrary minimum wage increase he got from Uncle Sam. Meaning, at best, he'll break even, and most of the time, it's a loss leader. This partially explains why the explosion in government since 2007 has led to a reduction in American wealth to 1992 levels. We're buying goods and services at 2012 prices with a standard of living that is 20 years old. We have a saying on our radio show, why be in a hurry to be wrong? I know our willingness to immediately comment on things we actually haven't researched and analyzed frustrates some in this instant gratification world. But it also helps us to sleep well at night and avoid looking foolish, as the Huffington Post recently did. Headlines said fast food workers are demanding a living wage of $15 an hour. Of course, how do we know that's actually a living wage? Why not demand $20 an hour, or $50 an hour, or $100 an hour? A full-time job that pays $15 an hour comes out to $31,200 a year, not counting overtime. Can you really live the American dream, own a home, own a car, send your kids to good schools, and then eventually college, one family vacation per year on $31,200? After all, the federal poverty line for a family of four is currently $23,550 per year, but I digress. Of course, never wanting an opportunity to play class warfare, outlets like the Huffington Post, owned by Arianna Huffington, who's got a net worth of $35 million, so of course she identifies with the plight of the downtrodden, were overly eager to report as fact analysis of McDonald's financials from an alleged University of Kansas research assistant named Arnovio Moralex. Moralex reported that if McDonald's immediately doubled all the wages of its employees, including the $9 million CEO, it would only have to raise the cost of a Big Mac by 68 cents and its dollar menu to $1.17 per item. This comes out to a measly 17% price increase. It all sounds well and good, of course, in magical thinking land, but there's one small problem. Moralex is full of shinola. First of all, you can't on one hand simply imply McDonald's is a greedy corporation that refuses to pay its employees a living wage and then fail to recognize that if McDonald's could get away with just arbitrarily raising their prices by 17%, they already would have done it. Wouldn't the greedy corporation you're smearing actually be bilking employees and customers at the same time if they could? Of course they would. Especially since customers pay into the business model, while employees are overhead that subtract from it. Hello, McFly? Anybody home? The reality is, just as employees want to make more money, so does the company. Employees would like to make $15 an hour instead of $7.50, and McDonald's would like to charge $10 per Big Mac instead of $3.99 as well. But if McDonald's isn't the federal government able to just print more money whenever it wants, that means McDonald's has to live within the natural laws of economics, which state you can't spend more than you have, and if you don't make a profit, you're out of business, and that means all the jobs are gone too. That simple application of common sense should have shown the Huffington Post that hitching its wagon to Moralex was a bridge to nowhere. But when thinking emotionally, common sense is in short supply. We don't have time to think for ourselves, mind you, when we're too busy reporting the story we want to be true, even if it's not. By the way, it turns out Morlex isn't a research assistant at the University of Kansas either. He's actually just an undergraduate student there. When it printed its correction story, the Huffington Post said they ran with the story without fact-checking any of Morlex's so-called data themselves. For example, the Huffington Post said prior to the publication, they asked Morlex if his analysis included franchises, and he said that it did. My translation, hey, this college kid told us what we wanted to hear, so we just took it all at face value. I wish my editors at places like USA Today would afford me the same courtesy when I submit a column. Instead, I routinely have to provide multiple sources for my assertions. By the way, it turns out Morlex didn't factor in McDonald's franchise business model, which accounts for more than 80% of McDonald's restaurants worldwide.
And that was Steve-Deace, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
How do you propagate the faith? With words? Yes, I believe in that, as I've done a lot of that in my life. But above all, you propagate Christ, by being conformed to him. When we do what he did, we bear other people's burdens. We take up the cross every day. When we do that, we become the most effective ambassadors possible for Christ. He uses people like us. I mean, we're unworthy vessels, God knows. But he uses us. So if someone sees you bearing the burdens of another, taking up your cross willingly, loving Jesus above your own life, well, he'll receive Christ through you. And in receiving Christ, he'll receive also the one who sent Christ, namely the Father. And you become thereby an icon of Christ, an ambassador of Christ. And you draw people into the divine love.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little something from Squawk Box.
The Fed's interest rate path, as well as millions of retail investors trying to make sense of the market. And the fallout from the ouster of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, reports say could lead to the dissolution of a key bipartisan alliance. We're going to speak with the co-chair of the House Problem Solvers Caucus.
So there you go. That's what he's telling you there is a flat-out lie. That's all there is to it. What he's suggesting is that things just happen. He says the fallout from is the dissolution of. One event leads to another. It's called determinism, and it's fiction, and it's a lie. He knows he's telling you a lie. Things don't just happen. They're made to happen. If there is an alliance in the House of Representatives and it dissolves, it will dissolve because the people in that alliance dissolved it, not because of inanimate objects beyond their control. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit more Squawk Box, where he's going to interview a guy from apparently there was a little small group of House members. What are they called? Promise Keepers. I don't know, some rhino name. And so he's going to interview them, and there's some interesting bits in here.
Republicans obtained by Axios says to continue to participate in the caucus would be to allow it to have the bipartisan credibility it now lacks. Joining us now, Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, co-chair of the Problem Solver Caucus. We watched, Congressman. We saw the end result, 0. Were there conversations beforehand, and can you tell me what the rationale was for supposedly bipartisan wishing individuals in the Democratic side of things? What was there? I mean, people differ with me when I call the Democrats the Borg Collective, but they never break. They never break ranks, ever, because they love to stay in power so much. And that's what we saw again. Am I reading it wrong?
Well, of course we met. We met several times before this vote. We don't discuss internal caucus deliberations in public, but I will say that there are a lot of us that are very upset, and you can include me in that. This was a golden opportunity for us to come together and actually oppose a move by the extremists in Congress. The whole institution fell short on that day. And it's a terrible day for our Congress, a terrible day for America. And what's really heartbreaking for me, I will tell you, is this all came about because Speaker McCarthy put a two-party solution on the floor to avert a government shutdown. No. That's the kind of conduct that's supposed to be rewarded, not punished.
Right.
And for all these things that are critically important, particularly to the markets, averting a debt crisis by solving the debt ceiling. Kevin McCarthy did that and stabilized the markets. Government shutdown. Kevin McCarthy pulled a rabbit out of his hat for that at the last minute. And it was the Senate that actually stood down and took up the House bill. So this kind of conduct needs to be rewarded, not punished in America.
So there you go. So the problem here is that the guy that's doing the interviewing, the fat old guy, didn't get with this congressman immediately. The first thing you need to do is establish who this guy is. So first thing you got to ask him is, are you a conservative? Because he keeps talking about extremists, but he doesn't identify himself as to who he is. Is he a moderate? Is he an extremist? Is he a MAGA? Is he a schmaga flaga dadaga? Where does he stand politically? No answer. Then the other part is, where do you stand in this particular fight? Are you pro-McCarthy or pro-Getz? No answer. But we can get an idea. It sounds to me like he is on McCarthy's side, which doesn't surprise me at all. Problem solvers. This is what the rhinos do. To give themselves cover, instead of forming a caucus called the Rhinos, they form a caucus that gives them more respectability and faux authority. We're the problem solvers. You can't tell us what to do. You can't negotiate with us because we are the problem solvers. Well, you did a crappy job this time, buddy. So, but this is what happens with for-profit news. This is why we need non-profit news now. Thank you. And now a little bit from the bloody tourist himself, Stuart Varney, who decided actually to show up for work today.
Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. Talk about a reversal. President Biden will build a border wall. Okay, only 20 miles of it in Starr County, Texas. But Border Czar Mayorkas says there's an immediate need for physical barriers. Perhaps the president is trying to look good, just as the Republicans embarrass themselves. The wall announcement came just as the Matt Gaetz fiasco rolls on. Without a speaker, the House can do very little, and we'll have to wait till next week to elect someone to replace Kevin McCarthy. Expect the Democrats to exploit the Republican dilemma. Conservatives got nothing. To the mark.
So there you go. The question is he expressing fact? Is this news? Is that what he's talking about right now? Is this news or is this opinion? Unknown. He doesn't say. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
Morning, and now this. When you look at the Republican Party today, what do you see? Civil war. Oh dear, that's not an attractive image for any political party, especially 14 months before the presidential election. The Republicans are not very good at politics. At this moment, President Biden is vulnerable. Now, that's an understatement. He's widely considered to be too old. Very few people believe he's capable of being president for another 5 years. Voters are worse off financially. Middle America can't afford a house or rent. There's a long list of political negatives to hang around the president's neck. Worst of all, for Democrats, some polls show Biden losing to Donald Trump. And in comes Matt Gaetz. He blows up Kevin McCarthy's speakership, bitterly divides House Republicans, and tries to come across as the great savior of conservatism. Oh, and by the way, there's another spending fight coming soon, so the Republicans can put their divisions on display all over again. Voters are watching. The Matt Gaetz fiasco may be changing the election calculus. Just as the drama unfolded in Congress, the president was out there giving another $9 billion worth of student debt relief. That's popular. And today he announces he's building 20 miles of border wall. Now he can say he understands the migrant and fentanyl problem, and he will take action. The Democrats are very good at politics. They will take advantage of the Republican debacle. They love Matt Gaetz. Second hour of Varney, just getting started.
So there's the Stuart Varney's My Take, and he is the well, anyways. So he's wrong about all this. Where he's right and he's wrong. Yes, Republicans are not very good at politics, and it's people like him and the other commentators that are not very good at politics. Because the people that are really taking advantage here are the Democrats, and the way they're doing it is by creating chaos and then blaming the Republicans. Creating chaos, then blaming the Republicans. Remember, I'd said before that part of the overall strategy here for the Democrats, if you want people to want socialism, to want authoritarianism, what do? One of the things that you do is you convince people that democracy is dead, that democracy is chaos, that democracy is unreliable, that democracy is unstable, and thereby get them to want authoritarianism. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking at here. Exactly the thing we're looking at here, where we have Stuart Varney and other people on the sidelines cheering for authoritarianism. Crackdown on the Republicans, crackdown on Matt Gaetz, and make sure that he stays in line and does what he's supposed to do. But it's really the Democrats that created the chaos. Remember, 209 Democrats voted with McCarthy for the continuing resolution. 209. Then, when his number was up in terms of the motion to vacate his seat, every single Democrat voted against him. Chaos? Okay. Republican chaos? When there was only 8 Republicans that voted against McCarthy? I don't think so. The Democrats pulled the wool over Republican eyes, and it wasn't over Matt Gaetz, and it wasn't, to a certain degree, Matt McCarthy, but really over the eyes of Stuart Varney, the tourist, the bloody tourist. Him and Maria Bartiromo, who threw a temper tantrum. Then there was some other lady from the Wall Street Journal who threw a temper tantrum. All the viewers on the sidelines are throwing temper tantrums and declaring chaos and that the Republicans don't know what they're doing. Bleh. And they're tools. Every single one of them are tools of the Democrats. So remember, when you go to work and your friends start talking to you about Republican chaos, you tell them that the chaos is not on the Republican side, but on the Democrat side. Back in a minute. Thank you. Another thing on all these Donald Trump legal issues that nobody's talking about that's a doable deal is to have people, I suppose you could have people from around the country do it if you just want to swamp the system. But you can have all kinds of people, particularly every right-thinking lawyer in the country, file motions with the state bar for Letitia James in New York, for the Attorney General in Georgia, and whoever's handling the cases in Florida, and file complaints against those attorneys and demand that they be disbarred. Think about it. Back in a minute. Thank you. So another thing to consider about this is history is continuous here, and with the situation with Matt Gaetz, he comes out and of course files the motion that is agreed to by 219 Democrats and 8 Republicans to remove Speaker McCarthy. So fine, but what nobody's talking about here with this is how we got here. How the hell did we get here? Simple, because the assholes in the Republican Party that decided that they would rather have a smaller majority in the House, no majority in the Senate, than have the candidates that Donald Trump picked win, those are the real problem. Those are the people, Mitch McConnell and all the rest, the donors and whatnot, that refused to back the candidates that Donald Trump picked, are the ones that created the minority in the Senate and a slim majority in the House. So again, it is the Republican Party that shoots itself in the foot, and then it shoots itself in the foot again when it blames one of its own that had nothing to do with it. Matt Gaetz didn't create a small majority in the House. It was Mitch McConnell and his ilk. So remember that as well. So if anybody's giving you, if any of your fellow Republicans, fellow conservatives are giving you gas about Matt Gaetz, that's the truth. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, inside Delta Force.
As Mao says, the guerrilla swims in the sea of the people. And in Delta Force, we operated like guerrillas, or terrorists. Because the reality was, in order to become experts at counterterrorism, we had to first become expert terrorists. We became completely insular in our relationships with outsiders. We didn't talk with anyone outside the unit about what we did. No, not even with our families. Even within the unit, we operated strictly on a need-to-know basis. If a teammate or friend happened to disappear for a while, you never asked where he had been or what he had been doing when he returned. If he had been on a new type of mission we needed to know about, we would be told of it in a briefing session to all the operators. So in very short order, operational security, OPSEC, became our underlying religion, and we naturally tended to restrict our dealings with outsiders. It became such habit that even today, when someone asks me what I do for a living or where I'm from, my first reaction is to give an evasive answer. During that formative period, Delta's operator training course, OTC, was 6 months long. Later years saw the addition of an accelerated military free-fall parachuting course, but the principal areas of instruction and the length of the course have remained constant over time. Our particular course would last from January to the end of June 1979. During that time, we would master the skills we needed to accomplish our mission. We would also develop new tactics and techniques for use within the organization. Shooting is both a science and an art. The science of shooting is principally concerned with exterior ballistics, what a projectile does in flight, how fast it initially takes off, how well it retains energy, its flight path in relation to the sight path, how it is affected by atmospheric conditions, what it does upon impact, and how it delivers its energy to a target. A few other scientific matters are concerned with the mechanics of the equipment, the consistency of powder loads and bullet weights and shapes, the accuracy of the barrel, and the gun's inherent tightness or sloppiness. The art of shooting is purely human. That comes into the picture when we hold a gun with this pulsing, trembling, quivering, and shaking body of ours. When we calculate all sorts of variables and try to make the round go off at just the precise instant that will cause the bullet to impact a tiny spot exactly where it was intended to go. Even when you're very good at it, you're never quite satisfied. And when you first start out, it can be a humbling exercise. But the mastery of this skill is ground zero for the Delta Force operator. Without it, he would be some other type of being. Because when it gets right down to it, a Delta operator is an extremely skilled killer. He is like the wolf that becomes a shepherd. He will guard the flock, but make no mistake about it, he remains a deadly predator. Shooting is divided into two categories, short guns and long guns, and so are operators. Assault team members are known as short gunners, and sniper observers are called long gunners. Everyone in OTC is trained on the long gun. Men chosen for sniper troops will be given specific and exhaustive training following their assignment. Instead of training with a fancy sniper rifle, we used the Army's standard M14, the predecessor of the M16. The M14 is the lineal descendant of the M1 Garand of World War II fame. The M14 is heavier than the M16, fires a much larger round, and has greater range and power. Gussied up and accurized, it is an excellent gun for target match shooting. Modified and mounted with a ranging telescope, it was used by the Army as a sniper rifle for years. Delta snipers still use it for certain tasks, but for the purposes of training, we used it in its plain Jane form. There's no point learning to drive a Porsche until you've mastered a Ford. We spent our first 3 weeks of the course on the rifle range. It was a good, stress-free way to get to know one another. It gave us a chance to change some initial impressions we had of the other men in the course, especially some I had made. There were 2 guys in selection I disliked on sight, and it turned out the feeling was mutual. Even though we probably never spoke to one another during selection, my dislike for them continued to build in the weeks before we started OTC. One guy was a stocky Californian from the 5th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg. The other was a dark, muscular guy from the Infantry Brigade in Alaska. I don't know why I disliked them so much in selection, but by the time we got to OTC, I was prepared to despise them, and they were equally prepared to return the favor. The Californian, Jerry Knox, was a fireball of a man. He had a sly sense of humor and more intensity of character than almost any man I've ever known. The muscle man, J.T. Robards, was utterly courageous, one of the most courageous men I've ever met. J.T. hated parachuting, said he was terrified of it. I was jump mastering a jump one day, and as we were shooting up, J.T. kept up a running commentary about how much he hated jumping and how much it scared him. Checking his equipment prior to boarding, I asked him in exasperation, "If you hate it so damn much, J.T., why have you stayed in airborne units for the last 15 years? It's voluntary, you know." He looked up at me in surprise and said, "Hell, Eric, I just like being with the kind of guys who like to do it." During OTC, we developed profound respect for each other and formed lifelong friendships, and this extended to every member as we gelled into a cohesive unit. This was the best group of men I've ever been associated with in my life. We had our differences now and again. That's only natural in any tightly knit clan, all the more so when it's a clan populated by tough-minded men. But we always worked out our differences, even if the working out got a little heated. But there was one ironclad rule in Delta. You never laid an angry hand on a brother operator. That was unforgivable and would result in immediate dismissal. It happened only once during my 8 years in the organization, and I don't believe it has ever happened since. So those first few weeks on the rifle range were valuable for a number of reasons. We got to know the character of our comrades, and we laid a common foundation on which to build core skills. Potential snipers were identified, chosen both for their natural talent and inclination to serve in that capacity. In those early days, we didn't have the luxury of taking years to develop sniper troops. The clock was already ticking, faster than we realized. The principal tools of the Delta Force assault team member are pistols and submachine guns. Initially, both of our short guns fired the same round, .45 caliber automatic pistol. Our submachine gun was the old World War II era M3 grease gun. We used that model over a more modern design because Colonel Beckwith snagged a warehouse full of them free from the CIA, and Charlie never could pass up a good deal. One of our guys complained about having to take so many of them, but Beckwith retorted, "Hell, you ain't gotta feed 'em, and you don't have to shovel shit out from under 'em, so what are you bitching about?" With practice, the grease gun is an easy weapon to use. Even given its poor sights and limited range, that .45 caliber round gives it some pretty impressive power. Within a year, we adopted the German-made Heckler & Koch model MP5 to replace it, but we kept a few grease guns around to use as silenced weapons. It was unsurpassed in that mode. The round is subsonic, so it doesn't give off a crack as it passes through the air, but it's heavy enough to retain a lot of energy and killing power. Our pistol was an accurized version of Colt's M1911A1, the old Army standby. This .45 caliber pistol is a big, hard-hitting weapon, inherently accurate but difficult to master. Each operator has two, and they are the weapons he uses more than anything else for close-in work. Pistols are trade-offs. You trade power, range, and accuracy for portability and concealability. With the .45, we kept the power we wanted, and constant intensive training gave us the range and accuracy. Our primary pistol shooting method was called instinctive fire, and it is considered a fundamental skill for deadly combat at close range. Here's why. Most shooting is based on the methods used in target shooting, that is, staring at the front sight while shooting. The same thing holds true with a pistol, if what you're concerned with is target shooting. But a close-range gunfight is a world away from target shooting, and then some. Combat shooting is more akin to wing shooting, shooting birds on the wing, and you can do it only by watching the target and giving it your whole concentration. Rather than smoothly squeezing the trigger until it goes off, you have to slap the trigger at just the right instant to hit the target. And before you can shoot a target, you must identify it. You have to determine who the terrorist is. You have to separate the deadly threat from the innocent bystander. And to do that effectively, you have to look at people instead of your sights. If your training has taught you to look at your sights, and suddenly, out of sheer survival instinct, you find yourself looking at your opponent, you'll shoot high at best. More likely, you'll have no idea where your gun is in relation to your opponent, and you'll miss him altogether. That's why so many cops fire shots that miss during an armed confrontation. They're looking at their opponents, but they trained looking at their sights. There's an old saying in the Army that you should train the way you fight. For the most part, the Army ignores it. That's why regular Army units almost always get their asses kicked in their initial battles, unless they have a long train-up period before their first taste of combat. Under those conditions, units will develop training programs that actually prepare men for combat. But for some strange reason, the generals and other senior officers see to it that peacetime training has little resemblance to reality. But in Delta, the only unit in the entire Army on continual war footing, we didn't have the luxury of wasted training time. When the bell rings, we have to come out of the corner not just swinging, but landing killing blows. You have to look at your enemy and hit him, right where you want to hit him. Kill him and take him out of the fight before he can cause any harm. If you're in a deadly fight in a room or the cabin of an airplane, you can't afford to do anything else. Initially, we fired one round at a time. When we could consistently hit the spot we were looking at, told to look at, told to hit, we increased the distance. When we had that distance down, we moved close to the target again and practiced slapping double taps, 2 very fast shots in the same spot. The intention with the double tap is to create a terrible wound that's sure to be fatal. We did it over and over and over. Soon the fun went out of it and it became work, and about that time it became painful. The .45 is a powerful pistol with sharp recoil, and the tight grip we used meant we absorbed the full force of the recoil in our hands and arms. Soon, like everyone else, I had a large, painful blister in the web of my thumb from the pounding of the gun in my hand. It would heal just enough at night to really hurt the next day. After a while, the blister turned into a big callus that stayed on my hand for the next 8 years. The surest way to identify a Delta Force assault team member is by that telltale callus on his firing hand. They all have one. Shoot we did. 8 hours a day, thousands of rounds downrange. We shot till our targets were destroyed, and then we put up new ones. When we had the technique down standing in one position, the instructors taught us turning movements left and right. When we mastered that, we learned to turn our backs to the targets, face about, and shoot on command. Then we learned to walk and shoot. At first, we walked directly toward the target and then parallel to it, then away from it, spinning and firing on command. We worked in 4-man groups, led by one of the 4 instructors, Bill, Mike, Bob, or Alan. We changed instructors every day. Our skills increased along with our confidence in one another, and we stood closer and closer to the other members of our team while firing. Soon we were shooting multiple targets, first in 2s and 3s, then whole groups. Next, we added good guy targets mixed in with the bad guys. The targets got closer together, and the bad guys were sometimes partially covered by the good guys. Then we mastered shooting on the run, always closing with the targets, always being aggressive. We would transition from the submachine gun to the pistol, or from the pistol to the submachine gun. Our instructor would load a pistol for us and intentionally induce a malfunction or load only a partial magazine, so we would have to execute a transition to another weapon or a reload drill or clear a malfunction. Our response to the unexpected had to be routine. Then we did these things in teams of 2s and then 3s and then 4s. We would engage a group of targets as a team, closing with them and distributing fire while remaining acutely aware of the man adjacent to you, often shooting near him and he near you. The point was to calculate angle of fire on the move, hitting the bad guys without the rounds going through them and hitting a good guy. To hit A good guy meant an immediate Chinese self-criticism drill.
And that was the next section of Inside Delta Force, called Preparing the Force. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.